You wake up one morning and every girl in your village, every daughter you know, every sister between 13 and 25 is suddenly forbidden to marry. Government officials ride through the streets shouting the ban 1 month, 2 months. Marriage is illegal across the entire peninsula. Your neighbor scratches his daughter's face with medicine hoping to make her ugly. Another family marries their 11-year-old to a peasant boy before dawn. Some girls are hidden in Buddhist temples, their heads shaved, becoming nuns overnight. Others flee to the mountains. The ones who stay lock their doors and pray the selectors pass them by. Because when the UN envoys arrive from China, they will take the beautiful ones, and those girls will never come home the same. In 1270, after 40 years of brutal war, Goryeo capitulated to the Mongol Empire. The kingdom signed a treaty, bent the knee, became a vassal. King Wonjong agreed to everything Kublai Khan demanded: gold, silver, ginseng, cloth, grain, falcons for hunting, eunuchs for the palace, and women, beautiful young women to serve the emperor in his court. The Mongols called Goryeo a son-in-law state, a client kingdom tied by marriage. Every Goryeo king from 1274 forward married a Mongol princess from the Yuan imperial family. The bloodlines mixed, the cultures tangled. But beneath the diplomatic marriages ran something darker, a systematic extraction of Korean daughters that would last 80 years. In 1274, King Chungnyeol married Kutluk Kelmish, youngest daughter of Kublai Khan. His reign marked the beginning of wholesale Mongolization. Mongol fashion, Mongol language, Mongol customs flooding the Goryeo court, and the tribute system began. Every 3 years, the Yuan emperor demanded women from Goryeo, teenagers, virgins and widows both. The numbers varied, but documents show 140 women in single shipments. Almost 1,500 Korean women were recorded as tribute in Yuan and Goryeo documents. Another estimate pushes the real number above 2,000 when you count the personal maids and servants who traveled with them, and the undocumented girls taken by individual envoys. The Goryeo government created 3 mechanisms to fulfill the quota. First act, establish a marriage ceremony supervisor called the Gayelandogam. Second act, ban all marriages when selectors arrived. Third act, create the office for ascertaining widows or virgins. Officials with one job identify eligible girls, document their birth dates, family genealogies back 3 generations, physical descriptions, build the list, make the selection, send them north. In 1333, a 16-year-old girl named Kai Zhao's daughter left Hangzhou, near modern Goyang. She was Lady Jai, born to a lower-ranked aristocratic family of bureaucrats. Not wealthy, not powerful, but educated, beautiful, skilled at dancing, conversation, singing, poetry, calligraphy. She was sent as tribute to the Yuan capital, Khanbalik, present-day Beijing, among hundreds of young men and women. Tribute, that word, like baskets of ginseng and silver ingots. She arrived at the imperial palace and became a maid, assigned to serve tea. Emperor Togun Timur noticed her immediately. She was extremely beautiful by Yuan standards. Goryeo women were fashionable among the Mongolian elite. Prestigious to marry, exotic to possess, Lady Gi became his favorite concubine. By 1339, she bore him a son, Ayushiridara. He declared the boy his successor. In 1340, she was named secondary empress. In 1365, after the primary empress died, she became Empress Gai, the only Korean woman to rule as empress of the Yuan Dynasty. But her story is the exception. One girl who climbed from tribute to throne, the others, 1,500 nameless daughters scattered across China as concubines, servants, palace maids, most never gained power, most never returned home, and those who did return faced something worse than exile. The women who survived and came back to Goryeo were called Gongnyeo, literally, women who returned to their hometown, but the word carried contempt, discrimination. They were damaged goods, used women who had served foreign men, even if they had been forced, even if they had been teenagers. The term Gongnyeo became the origin of Gwangyangyeon, a word that evolved into one of the worst insults for women in the Korean language. To be tribute was to be ruined. To return was to be shamed. So families fought the selections with everything they had. When UN envoys announced their arrival, the marriage ban dropped across Goryeo like a cage. Every unmarried daughter between 13 and 25 fell under suspicion. The government required families to register daughters, names, birth dates, times of birth, 3 generations of genealogy. Officials compiled lists, ranked girls by beauty and status. The envoys stayed for 1 or 2 months. During that time, no legal marriages could occur. The penalty for marrying during the ban was severe: confiscation of property, exile, beatings. But families took the risk. Parents married daughters to peasants in secret midnight ceremonies. 11-year-olds wed to escape future selections. Families paid bribes to officials to remove names from lists. Others took more drastic measures. They painted medicine on their daughters' faces to create rashes and scars. They cut their daughters' hair short, destroying their beauty. They applied toxic herbs that left permanent marks. One father scratched his daughter's face with a blade, claiming she fell. Another told officials his daughter had leprosy. Lies stacked on lies, desperation driving every choice. Some families sent daughters to Buddhist temples. The girls became nuns overnight. Shaved heads, robes, vows of celibacy. Not because they had religious callings, but because nuns were exempt from tribute. Monasteries sheltered hundreds of terrified teenagers. When the envoys left, some girls returned home, others stayed in the temples. Their lives already destroyed by the selection system, even though they had never been chosen. The wealthiest families had another option: send their daughters to relatives in distant provinces, hide them in rural estates where selectors wouldn't look. The poorest families had no options. Their daughters were the easiest targets: lower-class girls, daughters of minor officials, orphans with no powerful connections. The selectors took them first. Beauty was the primary criterion, but so was vulnerability. Girls without fathers to bribe officials. Girls without family influence to resist. The selection process happened in stages. First, officials visited families and examined registered daughters. They recorded physical descriptions: height, skin tone, facial features, body type. Second stage, officials brought selected girls to regional centers for Yuan envoys to inspect. The envoys walked among the girls, examined them like livestock, chose the ones they wanted. Third stage, chosen girls were taken to the capital, Kaesong, for final inspection. The Yuan chief envoy made the last selections. The unchosen girls returned homes, but their reputations were damaged. They had been inspected by foreign men, seen, evaluated. Families struggled to marry them off. The chosen girls were prepared for transport. They received new clothes, Goryeo silk embroidered with patterns the Yuan court preferred. They were taught basic Mongolian phrases. Officials drilled them on palace etiquette: how to walk, how to bow, how to serve tea, how to speak only when addressed. The girls traveled in groups, accompanied by Korean eunuchs and older women who would serve as their attendants in Yuan. The journey to Khanbalik took weeks. Some girls were 13. Most were between 15 and 20. They left Goryeo and crossed into Mongol territory, and most of them never saw Korea again. In 1332, a Goryeo scholar named Yi Gok, also romanized as Li Gok, born 1298 doors, petitioned King Cheongsuk to end the tribute system. He wrote about the devastation it caused, the terror spreading through Goryeo families, the marriage ban that froze normal life, the demographic damage as families hid daughters and rushed into inappropriate marriages. His petition reached the Yuan court. It coincided with Yuan's own internal decline. In 1332, the tribute system was temporarily abolished, but the relief was brief. Yuan still demanded women through individual requests from high officials. Envoys still took girls. The systematic annual quota disappeared, but the practice continued until King Gongmin's reign in the 1350s. The Yuan court distributed tribute women to reward loyal ministers. Kublai Khan gave a Goryeo woman to his Tibetan finance minister, Sangha. When Sangha was executed in 1291 for corruption, Kublai seized his assets, including the woman. He then gave her to an Indian prince from a bar who was residing in Quanzhou. She was property. Traded between men like a horse, Yuan envoys regularly visited Goryeo to procure women in the emperor's name. The emperor distributed them to leading ministers on many occasions. The women became tools of imperial patronage. Some Goryeo women in the Yuan court maintained ties to family members in Korea. Their families expected them to protect Korean interests. This created networks of influence. A tribute girl who became a concubine could send messages home. She could advocate for her brother's career. She could warn her family about Yuan policies. But this also made them targets. If their families fell from power in Goryeo, the women in Yuan lost protection. If they supported the wrong faction, they could be executed. Empress Gi used her power to elevate her family. Her father was posthumously made a king by the Yuan court. Her mother received official visits from the Goryeo king himself, and was granted trips to the Yuan capital Daidu. Her older brother Qi Cheol became commander of the Mongol Eastern Field Headquarters, effectively ruling Goryeo. Another brother became minister of the left. The Gi family's corruption and arrogance made them hated in Goryeo. They stole property, seized slaves, extorted bribes. They were untouchable because Empress Gi controlled Emperor Togun Timur. In 1351, the Goryeo court executed her younger brother Kai Samman for abusing his influence. Despite this, King Gongmin initially tried to work with the Gi family. He sent gifts to Lady Gi. He promoted Qi Cheol. He believed the Ji family could help Goryeo maintain good relations with the weakening Yuan, but Qi Cheol's power grew beyond the king's control. He had more authority than the monarch. He made decisions without consulting the throne. He appointed officials. He extracted taxes. King Gongmin watched a Korean subject rule Korea from a position granted by foreign power. In 1356, King Gongmin launched a purge. He exterminated the Gi family in Goryeo, every member he could reach. Ki Chol and his relatives were executed or driven into exile. Gongmin declared Goryeo independent from the crumbling Yuan Dynasty. Empress Gi, safe in the Yuan capital, erupted in rage. She named a new Goryeo king, Tash Timur, and sent Yuan troops to invade her own country, the country that had sent her as tribute. She sent an army to punish Goryeo for killing her family. The Yuan expedition failed. Goryeo forces defeated the Yuan army at the Yalu River. Empress Gi's attempt to control Goryeo through military force collapsed. If you value documented Korean history and the truth about tribute systems, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Goryosa, the official history compiled during the Joseon Dynasty, published 1451. We also used Yuan Dynasty documents, including the history of Yuan, compiled under the Ming Dynasty, published 1370 to 1394. Academic sources include Kyung-moon Hwang's A History of Korea, published 2010 by Palgrave, and articles from the Classic Journal, published January 11, 2025, referencing Goryeo Saw translations and analysis by Caroline Schatzer. We cross-checked with David M. Pai, Robinson's Empire's Twilight, Northeast Asia, Under the Mongols, and Peter H. Lee's Sourcebook of Korean Civilization, Columbia University Press, 2013. These are not generic sources. These are deep archival records and peer-reviewed scholarship, drilling into Goryeo legal codes, and administrative documents, and contemporary Korean chronicles. This is the truth. Now back to the information. Inside the Yuan palace, tribute women were divided into different classes. Some became concubines of the emperor or princes. They had status, protection, political leverage. Others became palace maids, servants who cleaned, cooked, carried water, attended to the emperor's wardrobe. The lowest class worked as laborers, washing laundry in the palace grounds, emptying chamber pots, hauling goods. Their lives depended on their beauty and their luck. A girl might arrive expecting to serve tea and end up scrubbing floors for 30 years. The competition among tribute women was brutal. They were foreigners in a Mongol court that viewed them as exotic but inferior. Chinese officials despised them. Mongol nobles used them. The primary empresses, Mongol women from the Borjigin imperial clan, saw them as threats. When Emperor Togun Timur tried to promote Lady Gi to secondary wife in the 1330s, the opposition was fierce. The chief minister Bayan, who held real power in Yuan, opposed it. The Empress Dowager considered Lady Gi cunning and dangerous. Promoting a Korean tribute woman to secondary wife violated standard practice. Only women from Mongol clans received that honor. Togun Timur was forced to back down. He couldn't elevate the woman he loved because she was Korean. When Lady Gi finally became secondary wife in 1340 it was because she had done something no other tribute woman achieved. She bore the emperor a son he declared his successor. That changed everything. The boy, Ayu Shiradara, gave her political leverage. She was not just a concubine anymore. She was the mother of the crown prince. Her position became unassailable. In 1365, after the primary empress Bayan Kutug died, Lady Gi became Empress Gi. She ruled as empress for only 3 years before the Ming Dynasty rebelled and drove the Yuan from China in 1368. Empress Gi, Emperor Togun Temur, and Crown Prince Ayu Shiradara fled to Mongolia. What happened to her after that is unknown. She vanished from the historical record, likely died in exile. But her story obscures the 1,500 other women. Most of them were not beautiful enough to catch an emperor's eye. Most were not talented enough to rise through palace ranks. Most served in silence and obscurity. Some died young from disease. Others aged into invisibility, becoming elderly servants no one noticed. A few managed to maintain connections with family in Goryeo, sending letters through traveling merchants or Korean eunuchs. But communication was difficult and dangerous. When officials monitored correspondence, a woman caught sending political information to Goryeo could be executed. The women who returned to Goryeo faced a different kind of death, social death. They were polluted. They had been touched by foreign men, used. Even if they had only served tea, even if they had resisted, even if they had been children when taken, the stigma was absolute. Families rejected them, neighbors shunned them, men refused to marry them. They were called Gongnyeo, and the term was an insult. Some returned women killed themselves rather than face the shame. Others lived as outcasts, scraping survival on the margins of society. The tribute system fractured Goryeo families. Brothers lost sisters, fathers lost daughters, communities lost their girls. The demographic impact was measurable. Villages with too many daughters hid them, creating pockets of unmarried women. Other villages saw their female population depleted, leaving young men unable to find wives. The marriage ban that accompanied each selection created artificial marriage booms when the ban lifted. Hundreds of rushed marriages in the weeks after envoys departed. Families married daughters as young as 10 or 11 to peasants, servants, anyone, just to protect them from the next selection. King Gongnyeo, who married Kublai's daughter and began the tributary relationship, could not stop the demands. He was the son-in-law of the Yuan Emperor. His queen was Mongol. His children were half Mongol. He had no leverage. King Chongson, his son, spent more time in Beijing than in Goryeo's capital Kaesong. He preferred the life of a scholar in the Yuan court, collecting books, hosting literary salons. He built a library called Mangwendang and invited Goryeo and Yuan scholars to exchange ideas. He abdicated twice, unable to handle the political intrigue. He did nothing to stop tribute selections. King Chengsuk, Chengson's son, also spent years as a hostage in the Yuan court before becoming king. In 1321, he was even interned by Yuan officials as part of a succession dispute. When he returned to the Goryeo throne, he was a broken man, powerless to resist Yuan demands. His son, King Chongye, was remembered in the Goryeosa as a monster, a king who abducted, raped, and killed women. He ruled from 1330 to 1332, and again from 1340 to 1344. Yuan envoys arrested him in 1343 and exiled him to China. He died on the journey. His crimes were so extreme that even Yuan officials couldn't ignore them. These were the kings who ruled Goryeo during the height of the tribute system. Weak men, hostages of Yuan, raised in the Mongol court, married to Mongol princesses. They had no power to protect their people. They were administrators of a vassal state. The real decisions came from Khanbalik. Yuan officials stationed in Goryeo as darugachi, resident commissioners, monitored everything. They were nominally subordinate to the Goryeo king, but held de facto veto power over royal decisions. They reported directly to the Yuan emperor. They could depose a king if he resisted Yuan policy. The Yuan Dynasty established the branch secretariat for eastern campaigns in Goryeo in the 1280s. Originally created to facilitate Yuan's invasions of Japan, it became a permanent institution of Mongol political control. The Goryeo king served as nominal head to Auras. But Yuan officials held the key positions. The branch secretariat managed tribute collection, troop levies, and political appointments. It bypassed the traditional Goryeo bureaucracy. Korean officials who wanted real power had to work through the branch secretariat, which meant loyalty to Yuan, not Goryeo. This system meant the tribute women were not just gifts, they were tools of empire, a mechanism to keep Goryeo dependent. Every 3 years, Yuan envoys arrived and reminded Goryeo of its vassal status. Every selection created fear and chaos. Every departure of girls to China reinforced who held power. The Mongols didn't need to station large armies in Goryeo. They controlled the kingdom through marriage, tribute, and terror. The daughters taken to Yuan didn't just disappear into the palace, they changed the empire. By the mid-14th century, Goryeo culture had heavily influenced the Yuan Dynasty's fashion and lifestyle in the capital. Korean clothing became prestigious among Mongolian nobles. Korean food spread through aristocratic households. Korean palace women introduced Korean customs, music, and art. A Karluk poet named Nasin traveled to Khanbalik in 1355 and wrote a poem comparing the poor existence of Chinese villagers to the life of luxury a Korean woman experienced in the capital. The women were status symbols. Owning a Goryeo concubine signaled wealth and taste. But luxury doesn't erase captivity. These women were prisoners with silk chains. They couldn't leave the palace without permission. They couldn't return to Korea without imperial approval. They were monitored by eunuchs, many of whom were also Korean, also tribute. The palace was a cage, and inside that cage, Korean women formed networks. They protected each other, shared information, negotiated small freedoms. When a new girl arrived from Goryeo, the older women taught her survival, how to avoid the emperor's temper, which eunuchs could be bribed, which palace ladies were dangerous, how to send secret letters home. Korean eunuchs became critical intermediaries. Boys taken from Goryeo, castrated to serve the palace. They had no power but access. They moved through the palace freely, carrying messages, delivering gifts, whispering information. Some became wealthy and influential. Bak Bulhwa was one of Empress Gi's closest servants. He helped her consolidate power, managed her finances, acted as her spy. She gave him a position in her special government agency where she wielded authority over tax collection. Korean eunuchs and Korean palace women formed a parallel power structure inside the Yuan court. This created resentment. Chinese officials hated seeing Koreans gain influence. Mongol nobles resented tribute women marrying into their families. The primary empresses, pure-blooded Mongol women from the Borjigin clan, despised the competition. When Lady Gai became empress, it was a scandal. The first non-Mongol empress, a tribute woman from a vassal state, Ming Dynasty. Historians later blamed her for the fall of the Yuan. They wrote that her corruption and extravagance weakened the empire. They called her greedy, manipulative, destructive. They erased her intelligence, her political skill, her economic reforms. Empress Gai created a special government agency devoted to tax collection. She controlled maritime trade, investing in shipping routes that brought wealth to the Yuan treasury. She learned how to rule by reading historical texts, Woman's Book of Filial Piety, and biographies of past Chinese empresses. She studied governance while the emperor lost interest in state affairs. By the late 1350s, she was the de facto ruler of China, a nation with a population of 60 million, the most powerful Korean woman in history. But in Goryeo, her family's downfall and her attempt to invade made her a traitor. The Goryosa, compiled during the Joseon Dynasty, listed the Gai family under traitors. The official history devoted extensive space to denouncing the Gi family for arrogance and corruption. Empress Gai was remembered not as a survivor who climbed from tribute to empress, but as a woman who betrayed her homeland. The Ming Dynasty's official history reinforced this view. She became the scapegoat for Yuan's collapse. Her story was written by her enemies, by the dynasties that replaced the one she served. The truth is more complex. She was a teenager sent as tribute, forced into a foreign court, who used her intelligence to survive and gain power. She protected her family. She tried to control Goryeo because Goryeo had exterminated her relatives. She was not a villain. She was a woman trapped in an impossible situation who refused to be powerless. The other 1,500 women don't even have that much. No names, no stories, just numbers and tribute documents. Some worked in the palace for decades and died as servants. Others were given to Yuan officials as rewards and disappeared into provincial households. A few returned to Goryeo after Yuan fell. Most died in China, buried in unmarked graves, forgotten by history. They were statistics in an imperial system that viewed them as resources to extract. Back in Goryeo, the fear never ended. Every 3 years, the cycle repeated. Envoys announced their arrival. The marriage ban dropped. Families scrambled to hide daughters. Officials compiled lists. Selectors arrived. Girls were taken. Even during the years when the formal quota was abolished, individual demands continued. A Yuan minister wanted a concubine. A Mongol general requested a servant. The Goryeo court complied. Refusal meant punishment, military intervention, economic sanctions, deposition of the king. King Gongmin, who ruled from 1351 to 1374 at home, was the first to resist. He spent years in the Yuan court as a hostage before becoming king. He married a Mongolian princess, Budashiri, who became Queen Indeok. She was beloved in Goryeo, remembered as compassionate and wise. When she died, Gongmin grieved deeply. Her death changed him. He began to see Yuan's control as intolerable. In 1356, he purged the Gai family and declared independence. He drove out Yuan officials. He reclaimed northern territories that Yuan had annexed, Sangsong and Dongyang prefectures, but independence came with a cost. Gongmin's reforms threatened the entrenched bureaucracy. Pro-Mongol aristocrats fought back. They plotted to remove him. To restore ties with Yuan, Gongmin grew paranoid, isolated, depressed. He turned to Buddhism, spending hours in meditation. He relied on a Buddhist monk named Shindon, giving him immense power. Shindon tried to redistribute land, breaking the aristocracy's control. This made Gongmin more enemies. In 1374, Gongmin was assassinated by his own officials. The Goryosa, written to legitimize the Joseon Dynasty that replaced Goryeo, portrayed his death as the result of moral failure. But the real reason was simpler. He challenged the system. After Gongmin's death, Goryeo descended into chaos. King Yu, Gongmin's supposed son, ruled from 1374 to 1388, but many believed he was actually the son of the monk Shindon, not Gongmin. His legitimacy was questioned. Pro-Yuan and pro-Ming factions battled for control. The tribute system had ended with Yuan's fall in 1368, ours, but the damage persisted. Goryeo was fractured, weakened, unable to govern effectively. In 1388, General Yi Songyei staged a coup. He overthrew Goryeo, executed the last kings, and established the Joseon Dynasty in 1392. The new dynasty tried to erase the shame. Joseon distanced itself from Goryeo's vassalage. It aligned with the Ming Dynasty, paying tribute to China but under different terms. Joseon sent tribute women to Ming as well, but the system was slightly different. The selections were less frequent, the numbers smaller. Joseon also institutionalized Neo-Confucian values that made women's status even lower than in Goryeo. Women lost the right to inherit property equally. Widows were forbidden to remarry. Women were expected to be faithful to their husbands beyond death. If a widow remarried, her children were barred from the civil service exams, effectively destroying their futures. This made Joseon tribute selections even more devastating. A Goryeo daughter taken to Yuan might have returned home and faced discrimination, but she could still remarry, inherit property, rebuild her life. A Joseon daughter taken to Ming and returned faced social death. She had no legal rights. Her family might reject her entirely. Some families forced returned women to commit suicide to restore family honor. The Joseon Dynasty took Goryeo's trauma and made it worse, but the memory of Goryeo tribute women lived on in Korean culture. The word Hwangnyeo evolved into Hwanyangyeon, one of the harshest insults for women. It means promiscuous, unfaithful, shameful. It carries the stain of those girls sent north as tribute, even if they were forced, even if they were children. The language itself became a weapon. Korean society turned its victims into villains, blamed the women instead of the system that enslaved them. Modern historians debate how to remember tribute women. Were they victims of imperial exploitation? Yes. Were they complicit in a system that oppressed their homeland? Some, like Empress Gai, became powerful and used that power in ways that hurt Goryeo. But framing it as betrayal ignores the impossible choices they faced. Refuse the emperor and die. Serve the emperor and betray your family. Use your power to protect your relatives and become a traitor to your country. There were no good options. These were teenagers taken from their homes, thrown into foreign courts, and forced to survive. The historical sources on tribute women are limited and biased. The Goryeosa was written by Joseon officials who wanted to portray Goryeo as corrupt and weak to justify the new dynasty. The history of Yuan was written by Ming officials who wanted to blame the Yuan collapse on decadence and foreign influence. Convenient scapegoats were Korean women. Korean women appear in these texts as symbols of moral decay, never as individuals with agency. Even Empress Gai, the most documented tribute woman, is portrayed as a corrupting seductress, not as a skilled politician. Recent scholarship has tried to recover their stories. Kyung Moon Hwang's A History of Korea, published in 2010 by Palgrave, contextualizes tribute women within the larger framework of Mongol imperial administration. He notes that tribute systems were common across the Mongol Empire. The Mongols extracted women from conquered territories as a form of symbolic submission. Goryeo was not unique, but the scale and duration, 80 years of systematic selections, made Goryeo's experience particularly brutal. David M. Robinson's Empire's Twilight, Northeast Asia. Under the Mongols, published by Harvard University Press, examines how tribute women maintained ties to their families and used those connections to navigate Yuan court politics. He argues they were not passive victims but active participants in a complex system of transnational networks. Caroline Schatzer's research, published in the Classic Journal in January 2025, focuses on the legal aspects. She notes that Yuan law did not extend to Goryeo's internal matters. Goryeo retained control over its legal codes, criminal justice, and family law. This meant the tribute system operated in a legal gray zone. Goryeo officials enforced the marriage ban and conducted selections under UN pressures, but they used Goryeo legal mechanisms. The office for ascertaining widows or virgins was a Goryeo institution, not a Yuan imposition. This complicates the narrative. Goryeo was not a helpless victim. Its officials collaborated with Yuan demands, enforced selections, and punished families who resisted. The tribute women were not just victims of Yuan imperialism, they were victims of a Goryeo aristocracy that lacked the courage to resist. A bureaucracy that prioritized stability over justice, and a society that later blamed the women instead of the system. The families that hid daughters, the fathers who scarred their girls' faces, the mothers who sent daughters to monasteries, these were acts of resistance. But they were individual, desperate, unsystematic. There was no collective refusal, no mass protest, no rebellion. The selections continued for 80 years because enough people complied. When King Gongmin finally purged the Gi family and declared independence in 1356, Yuan was already collapsing. The Red Turban Rebellion was raging. Internal factions battled for control. The Ming Dynasty was rising. Gongmin's resistance succeeded not because of Goryeo's strength, but because of Yuan's weakness. If Yuan had still been powerful, the purge would have failed. Gongmin would have been deposed or executed. The tribute system would have continued. The end came not through Goryeo courage, but through Yuan collapse. In 1368, the Ming Dynasty drove the Yuan from China. The Mongols fled to the northern steppes and established the northern Yuan Dynasty. They no longer had access to Goryeo. They no longer had the power to demand tribute. The selection stopped, but the trauma remained. Goryeo families had lost daughters for 3 generations. Communities had been fractured. The demographic impact lingered for decades, and the social stigma attached to tribute women, that brutal word, Gongnyeo, persisted for centuries. If you value factual history that confronts uncomfortable truths, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. This research draws from the Goryeo royal family records. Book 41, documenting King Gongmin's 18th year, June 20, 1369. We used Goryeo Annals, Book 38, Criminal Law 1, examining statutes on tribute and family law, Peter H. Lee's Sourcebook of Korean Civilization, Volume 1, Columbia University Press, 2013, provided translated primary sources. We cross-referenced with academic articles from the International Journal of Korean History, Volume 6, December 24, analyzing women's lives during the Joseon Dynasty and tracing the legal frameworks back to Goryeo precedents. These sources dig into archival legal codes, court records, and contemporary chronicles that most people never access. This is documented truth. Now back to the story. The women who returned to Goryeo after Yuan fell carried stories no one wanted to hear. They had lived in a foreign empire, served foreign men, witnessed the inner workings of Yuan power. Some had valuable intelligence, trade routes, political alliances, military weaknesses. But Goryeo officials didn't interview them systematically. They didn't extract strategic information. Instead, society shunned them. These women could have been assets. They had linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, diplomatic experience, but the stigma was too strong. They were polluted, used, shameful. A few returned women found ways to survive. Some had wealth they had accumulated in Yuan through gifts or trade. They used that money to buy property in Goryeo, living quietly on rural estates away from judgment. Others became merchants, using their connections to facilitate trade between Korea and China. A handful entered Buddhist monasteries, spending their remaining years in religious seclusion, but most faced poverty, rejection, and early death. The average lifespan for returned tribute women was lower than for women who stayed in Korea. The trauma, the stigma, the lack of family support, all of it shortened their lives. The children of tribute women faced discrimination too. If a tribute woman bore a child in Yuan and brought that child back to Goryeo, the child was considered mixed blood, half Mongol or half Chinese, depending on the father. These children couldn't hold government positions. They couldn't marry into respectable families. They inherited their mother's shame. Some tribute women had children with Korean men after returning home, but those children also suffered. The mother's status tainted them. They were children of a Gongnyeo. That mark followed them through life. The Goryeo court never compensated tribute women. No pensions, no land grants, no recognition of their service or suffering. Compare this to Goryeo soldiers who fought in Yuan's wars. Veterans received land, tax exemptions, government positions. They were honored. But tribute women, who also served Yuan under compulsion, received nothing. The difference was gender. Soldiers were men. Tribute women were women. Goryeo society valued male sacrifice. Female sacrifice was invisible. This pattern continued into the Joseon Dynasty. When Joseon sent tribute women to Ming, the same discrimination applied. Returned women faced the same stigma. The Joseon government never established support systems, no programs to reintegrate returned women, no efforts to combat social discrimination. Instead, Joseon reinforced Confucian values that made women's situations worse. The ideology of widow chastity, the prohibition on remarriage, the emphasis on female virtue, all of it made returned tribute women even more vulnerable. By the late Joseon period, tribute selections to China decreased. The Ming Dynasty made fewer demands. The Qing Dynasty that followed Ming also requested tribute women, but less frequently. The practice gradually faded by the 18th century, but the cultural memory remained. Korean families continued to fear their daughters being taken. Folk tales about tribute women circulated, most of them emphasizing the women's suffering and the family's loss. These stories reinforced the message: your daughter is vulnerable, the government cannot protect her, foreign powers can take her at will. This fear shaped Korean attitudes toward foreign relations for centuries. The tribute system taught Koreans that weakness invites exploitation, that vassalage means losing your daughters, that powerful neighbors are always threats. These lessons influenced Korean diplomacy well into the modern era. Korea's complicated relationships with China and Japan, its desire for independence, its resistance to foreign influence, all of it connects back to this historical trauma. Modern Korean feminists have reclaimed tribute women's stories. They argue that these women were victims of both foreign imperialism and domestic patriarchy. The Yuan Dynasty exploited them. The Goryeo and Joseon governments failed to protect them. Korean society blamed them for their own victimization. This triple oppression, foreign, governmental, social, makes tribute women's experiences a lens for understanding women's historical positions in Korea. The Korean television series Empress Kai, which aired from 2013 to 2014 NT, portrayed Empress Gai as a heroic figure who protected her people and brought Korean culture to China. The show was controversial. Korean historians criticized it for being too sympathetic to a woman they considered a traitor. Professor Yoon Suk-jin worried that portraying Empress Gi as a warrior would create a positive image of her. The debate revealed how deeply the stigma persists. Even 650 years after her death, Koreans argue about whether a tribute woman who gained power deserves sympathy or condemnation. The question is unfair. It places moral weight on a teenager who was taken from her home and forced into a foreign palace. She didn't choose tribute. She didn't choose to become empress. She survived and gained power in the only way available to her, through the emperor's favor. Once she had power, she used it to protect her family. That's not betrayal. That's human. The real betrayal was the system that created tribute selections in the first place. The families that scarred their daughters' faces understood the system was wrong. The mothers who hid girls in monasteries knew. The fathers who married 11-year-olds to peasants knew. But individual resistance couldn't stop an imperial policy enforced by both Yuan and Goryeo governments. The tribute system was structural violence, systematic, bureaucratic, persistent. It continued because it benefited the powerful. Yuan gained access to Korean women and symbolic submission from a vassal state. Goryeo officials maintained their positions by complying with Yuan demands. The cost was borne by teenage girls and their families. When you examine the documents, the lists of names, the birth records, the genealogies, you see the bureaucratic machinery. Officials treated tribute selection like tax collection, quotas, deadlines, regional distributions. Girls were inventory. The Office for Ascertaining. Widows or virgins operated with cold efficiency. They developed criteria for beauty. They standardized inspection procedures. They created a system that could process hundreds of girls every 3 years without disruption. This bureaucratic approach masked the horror. A girl being torn from her family was a tragedy. 140 girls being processed through administrative channels was a logistical task. The system dehumanized the victims. It turned individual suffering into aggregate data. Officials reported numbers to the king: 140 girls sent this year, 120 next year. Success measured in quotas met. The UN court also bureaucratized reception. Tribute women arrived in Khanbaliq and were sorted. The most beautiful went to the emperor. The next tier went to princes and high officials. The remainder became palace servants. Each category had different living quarters, different duties, different prospects. The sorting happened within days of arrival. A girl's entire future determined by her appearance and a eunuch's evaluation. Inside the palace, tribute women were taught to erase their Korean identity. They learned Mongolian. They wore Mongol clothing. They adopted Mongol names. Empress Gi became Olye Kutuk. Her Korean name disappeared in official records. The UN court wanted them to become Mongolian, to forget Goryeo. Some women complied completely, severing ties to Korea. Others maintained secret connections, speaking Korean with fellow tribute women, preserving memories of home. The psychological impact was immense. Teenage girls ripped from families, transported to a foreign empire, forced to serve men they didn't know, unable to return home. Modern psychology would classify this as trafficking. The tribute system was state-sponsored human trafficking operating under the guise of diplomatic relations. The Yuan Dynasty didn't call it trafficking. They called it tribute. But the mechanism was identical: involuntary movement of women for sexual and labor exploitation. The long-term demographic effects are harder to measure. Goryeo lost approximately 2,000 women over 80 years. That's 25 women per year on average. In a population of several million, this seems small, but the impact was concentrated on specific age cohorts and social classes. Daughters of minor aristocrats and commoners aged 13 to 25. This created gender imbalances in certain communities and age groups. Villages that lost multiple girls in a single selection faced marriage shortages for years. The economic impact was also significant. Families that lost daughters lost potential laborers. In a primarily agricultural society, women worked in fields, managed households, produced textiles. A daughter taken to Yuan was a daughter who couldn't contribute to family economy. This pushed some families into poverty. The wealthiest families could absorb the loss, the poorest couldn't. The tribute system was a regressive tax that hit vulnerable families hardest. Goryeo's collaboration with the tribute system reveals something uncomfortable about the dynasty. The government that compiled the Tripitaka Koreana 81,258 wooden printing blocks carved during the Mongol invasions as a prayer for protection, also compiled lists of girls to send to Yuan. The government that produced world-class Celadon pottery and advanced printing technology also established the office for ascertaining widows or virgins. Goryeo was capable of remarkable cultural achievements while simultaneously participating in systematic oppression of its own daughters. This contradiction appears throughout Goryeo's history. The dynasty granted women property rights, allowed widows to remarry, recognized daughters as heirs, but it also sent those same women to foreign empires as tribute. The government protected women's legal rights while failing to protect their bodies. This isn't unique to Goryeo. Many societies throughout history have enshrined women's rights in some areas while denying them in others, but the contrast is stark. The tribute women's silence in historical records is itself significant. We have extensive documentation of the selection process, the bureaucratic mechanisms, the quotas, the transport logistics, but we have almost no first-person accounts from the women themselves, no diaries, no letters, no memoirs. They were literate. Many could write, but their voices don't survive. Either they didn't write, or their writings were destroyed, or historians didn't preserve them. The absence is deafening. Empress Gi is the exception. We have records of her actions, her political decisions, her family relationships, but these come from official histories written by men about her public role. We don't have her private thoughts. We don't know how she felt being sent to Yuan at 16. We don't know if she loved Emperor Togun Temur or simply used him. We don't know if she grieved for Goryeo or felt relief at escaping a society that viewed her as expendable. The histories tell us what she did. They don't tell us who she was. The excavation at Hangzhou, where Empress Gi was born, uncovered a memorial stone erected centuries after her death. The inscription is partially eroded, but readable sections describe her as daughter of Goryeo, who rose to power in a foreign land. The tone is ambiguous, not quite praise, not quite condemnation, just acknowledgement. A woman from this place became an empress somewhere else. The memorial stands in a forgotten corner of a mountain fortress, overlooked by tourists, ignored by most historians. It's a fitting metaphor for how Korea remembers its tribute women, acknowledged but not honored, remembered but not understood. In 2020, the local Goryeo government proposed restoring the memorial and creating a historical park dedicated to Empress Gi. The proposal sparked immediate controversy. Conservative groups opposed it, arguing that Empress Gi was a traitor who doesn't deserve commemoration. Progressive groups supported it, arguing that she was a victim of the tribute system who deserves recognition. The debate continues. The memorial remains unrestored. Even in death, Empress Gi generates conflict. The final fact that reframes everything. In 1368, when the Ming Dynasty expelled the Yuan from China, Goryeo officials conducted an inventory of tribute women still living in Yuan territories. They wanted to know how many survived, how many wanted to return, how many had married and started families in China. The inventory was incomplete. Many women were unaccounted for. Officials estimated at least 300 Korean women still lived in former Yuan territories, now controlled by Ming. The Goryeo court debated whether to negotiate their return. The debate lasted months. Eventually, they decided not to pursue it. Too expensive, too complicated, not worth the diplomatic effort. 300 women were written off, left behind, forgotten by the kingdom that had sent them as tribute decades earlier. That decision, to abandon 300 women in China, reveals the truth about the tribute system. Goryeo never valued these women. They were expendable resources, sent to appease a foreign power. When the power dynamics shifted and Yuan fell, Goryeo didn't reclaim its daughters. It left them in China and moved on. The tribute women were tools of diplomacy. And when they were no longer useful, they were discarded. That cold final calculation, that bureaucratic decision to abandon 300 women, that's how the tribute system ended, not with justice, not with compensation, not with recognition of suffering, just an administrative decision to close the file and forget.